or magic or any of that kind of stuff. I think it's important to keep some grounding or some sense of realism. Because that's the whole urban part of fantasy, right? Is that it's grounded in real life.
Yeah.
And if there's like a love triangle, every fucking book or every series,
I know.
I'm just like, that's not accurate. Who puts themselves through a love triangle, and who sits around waiting for somebody to decide whether they're worth their love or not?
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of really shifts me. And there's so many books that have done well with love triangles. I think it's a very easy thing to try and push that towards. But yeah, the love triangle would be one that really, really bugs me.
Okay, so how did the idea for Who's Afraid begin? What made it pop into your head?
A beautiful accident, I guess. Like all good stuff. I was actually planning to write a different book at the time. I was researching a series. I'd just come back from Egypt, so I was researching a series that would have been based on Egyptian mythology, but kind of similar to the X-Men. So think of it like an Egyptian mythology version of X-Men, and that's what I was planning out. Characters. Awesome. Yeah, I think it would be intriguing, and it would all be like descendants of those specific Egyptian gods, and it's something that maybe I hope I'll get to pick up a bit further down the track, but. That's what I was planning, and I was building those characters and doing research. And I every night when I go to sleep, the way that I get to sleep, instead of because I have a very active mind, so otherwise I'll just keep buzzing. But the way I get to sleep is instead of counting sheep or something like that, I'll imagine stories. And this character, Tommy Grayson, who it ended up to be, sort of popped into my head, and that ended up being the central protagonist for Who's Afraid. And it was kind of like the beginning of the journey. What would happen to somebody if they thought they were following their way down the family tree, and at the end of that family tree, there's very cool roots for something completely different, completely out of this world, and a little bit insidious to what they necessarily expected to find. And that's essentially where the idea came from. And every night when I go to sleep for a few weeks there, it was just that character and that story again. And I thought, you know what, Margaret, I'm just going to start writing this one. It's coming to me pretty easily. I can just write this. And I put together the first 4 chapters, and it just kind of snowballed from there, I guess you could say.
Okay, so Maria, you've written and you've been a journalist. You've reported on crime and stuff like that. But and you just mentioned that you were researching a different book entirely before you got the idea for Who's Afraid. What is this your first foray into writing a novel?
Yeah, it is my first foray, my first attempt.
Okay.
Who's Afraid is the first book that I've written. It's now not the last. I've got the first 4 in the series written.
Oh, excellent.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously it all depends on, if Who's Afraid crashes and burns.
No.
There's not going to be another bunch, but, that story means a lot to me, and I kind of knew where it was going from the beginning anyway, so I was like, you know what, stuff it. Publishing process takes a long time, so while we're working on getting the first one out, I may as well have the other books ready to go. And then I've also have another book written called It Came from the Deep, which is a science fiction mystery, kind of a bit of a play on the creature from the Black Lagoon, and it's like a reverse Little Mermaid. It's about a woman who discovers a merman, and that's also written and being shopped around at the moment.
Oh,
so
excellent.
Who's Afraid was my first, but it was kind of the gateway drug, I guess.
So, with your background as a journalist and making the leap into writing, it seems like, from the way you're talking about it, like it was the easiest thing in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, you know what? I'm not gonna lie. It was pretty easy. I think the main thing though that was easy is, so I started. I'm 27 now, and I started as a journalist when I was 16. I graduated high school and started working in a newspaper 2 weeks after that.
Right.
And the way it works is they kind of throw you in the deep end there. You get thrown in as a cadet into police rounds, and you either sink or you swim. And if you swim, you get stuck in that round for a long time. And so I was writing police stories for 2 or 3 years before I ended up moving into writing about entertainment and then doing features and all that kind of stuff. So by the time I got around to writing Who's Afraid, I was, let's say 20 or 21.
Yeah.
so at that point, I'd been a journalist for 4 or 5 years, and I'd been in this job where your main game, essentially, is to write a lot of words every day, day in, day out, and meet very specific deadlines under a high-pressure situation. So 5 years of being trained for that. By the time it came to writing fiction, it was like definitely an easy process in terms of getting the word count out. But the thing that was different was I remember the first chapter I wrote it, and then I went back and read it because I was editing it as I go, and I looked at it and I was like, oh God, this is terrible. It reads like a news story, you know, because you structure a news story to have like the most important piece of information in the first sentence to draw people in, and then it gets like least important as it descends.
Yeah.
And I had structured the first chapter like that. And I was like, oh God, this is a mess. I need to rework the whole thing. So you know, it was more. I didn't do a course or anything or get help from anyone until I'd written the bloody thing, which maybe isn't probably the best way to go about it, but it seems to have worked out okay at this point.
Okay. Is looking back, something you said previously just made me think of this. What do you wish someone had told you about publishing before you started this whole journey with Who's Afraid?
Oh God, that writing the book is the first process. Mm-hmm. You know, like there's so many times in the build up to Who's Afraid, and when I decided that I really wanted to do this, I went to a lot of author Q&As, not even with authors that I necessarily had read their books and loved. I just looked at authors that were successful or who had done what I wanted to do and written across genres and all this kind of thing. And I'd go to author Q&As and listen to the things they said, get advice, listen to how they interacted with fans and that kind of thing. And one of the pieces of advice everybody kept saying is like, oh, you know, the hardest thing is just to finish the book. Yeah. And I was like, all right, okay. And at this point I'd finished the book and thought, okay, you know, it was challenging, but the hardest part is not finishing the book. It's maintaining passion and endurance once you've finished it, because it is such a long, hard process after you have the book. You know, I think I was working out the other day how many times I've read Who's Afraid, and it's about between 110 and 115 times, you know, which is a lot. It's a lot for anything, like even something that you love or characters that have come from your own head. You know, you read a book that many times and it's like, you know, grinds away at you. But that's just the editing process, let alone the hustling of trying to get out there and get an agent. And then once you get an agent, maintaining enthusiasm and hope as it bounces from publisher to publisher, and you're having to pitch the story over and over again. I think, and to trying to build the brand for yourself. If you are lucky enough to get a book, then you've got to try and build publicity and hype and that whole thing. So writing a book is very hard, but I think maybe the hardest thing is maintaining passion and enthusiasm for it once it's done, because the process of getting it out there can be really, really soul-sucking. But yeah, hopefully worth it. I mean, it's not out yet, so I don't know if it's worth it, but it feels worth it at this point. As where I'm sitting right now, it feels worth it.
So would you say getting an agent was the best thing, or the best thing to start with?
Oh, hells yeah. It took me longer to get an agent than it did to get published. Yeah, it took me I want to say about maybe 2 to 3 years to get an agent. Yeah. And it took a year to get a publishing deal. And within that year, there were other places that were looking at it seriously and had it in that kind of, you know, like that holding pattern where they want it, but they're trying to see who else wants it and if they want it hard enough. And so that whole game of poker. But an agent, I mean, it's interesting. There's a few people on Twitter who've tweeted me saying, hey, I have a book, I want to get it published. There's a lot of places that do Manuscript Monday where you can send in your manuscript and people look through it, and like a lot of different ways where you can try and submit novels. Of course, the brilliance of the internet now is you can publish it yourself. And they've asked me about the advice, like whether they should try and get an agent or whether they should publish it themselves. And I think the great thing about an agent, especially in the literary world, is it's not like a movie agent, you know, where you pay them a wage or anything like that. They only make an income if the book sells. Okay. So they're only picking up books that they believe in, number one, and books that they believe can sell. So if you're represented by an agent, you've kind of already passed a really good quality test.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of publishers out there that won't even look at books unless you're represented. They won't look at unsolicited manuscripts, which makes it hard because it's kind of like a gateway, I guess. And there's definitely people whose books have broken through in that Manuscript Monday type scenario where you just send it in on a whim. But it's really tough to get noticed. And if you have an agent, they tend to have a roster of clients, they have contacts, they have everything. And so it's a really, like, their job essentially is to get your book to notice. So I think an agent is really important. And it's also, essentially, it's a professional